Greetings. Greetings and welcome to lesson number 8 in a teaching series on the Passion Week of Jesus. It's Wednesday now, and so we are going to take some time to think through Wednesday then. I had to kill the volume on my screen. So we're going to take a look at Wednesday of the Passion Week. We are one day before the 8-day cycle of the feasts of Passover and then unleavened bread. And it's the day before the slaying of the Passover lamb. Now, we have been tracing the record of this week as recorded in the 4 Gospels of the New Testament. And in that regard, we have something of a problem today, if you don't mind, simply because by my lights, and that is following the sequence of days that I'm arguing for, and the sequence which has been and is almost universally accepted by students of this drama. But by my lights, the gospel record is silent on this day. That is, it skips from the gospel record skips from late Tuesday until sometime on Thursday afternoon. And thus we have Silent Wednesday. Now, let me say that just because the record is silent doesn't mean that nothing is happening. And I'm going to argue that this day might just as well be titled Busy Wednesday. But more on that in just a moment. What I'd like to do in our lesson time today is to take the time to address some issues, some questions, which are really basic to any attempt to reconstruct the events of this blessed and all-important week, but they're questions about which, in some cases, good men disagree. And let me just say that my intent is not so much to persuade as to inform, to make the case that these issues can be settled, and thus, and here's the real issue, that the gospel record is real history. It's coherent. It can be reconstructed, honoring all the demands and details of history, chronology, sequence, interaction between people, and so on. It's coherent. It can be traced as any other set of historical events. So it is history, but to be sure, it's history that happened a long time ago. As a matter of fact, when you think about it, almost all of history happened a long time ago. But this particular drama is recorded in 4 eyewitness accounts, which is so much greater historical record than we have for most historical events. But the point is that there are details about which there is some debate. But there's no element of the story which is incoherent, which defies explanation. In short, the narrative is real history. So we're going to explore a couple of issues and then actually return to the narrative itself. And by the way, I plan to do this again on Saturday. I try to follow the comments. I appreciate very nice comments that come in and so on. It's an encouragement. But there are also some questions, and I'm going to react to a couple of those today. If there are questions, if you upload those into the comments section, I'll try to I'll try to find those, to ferret those out. And then perhaps we can address those on Saturday as we do this again, because Saturday is another silent day. All will acknowledge that. Now, again, some background events. And I'd like to begin by spending a few minutes talking about, frankly, Jesus and his family, his life. Because again, I think it's very easy to, I don't know, the impression that people have of Jesus is sometimes, I think, a bit distorted. And again, that's a rather broad statement. But my point is this, that Jesus is sometimes, I think, to some just sort of a paper doll figure, kind of a pretend figure, a bit of a fairy tale figure. And he's not that. He's a real person. On the other hand, I think others tend to, because of the inscrutable mystery that is absolutely intrinsic to what the Bible teaches about Jesus as the God-man. And we talked about this at the very beginning. And it's so important to obviously to embrace and insist upon the reality of his genuine deity. But by the same token, I think it's so important to understand, as mysterious as it is, that this second person of an eternal triune Godhead at a point in time, at a place, took upon himself genuine humanity. When Jesus was conceived in the woman, you know what, I got to back up. When that second person of the Trinity became Jesus, when that second person was in fact conceived by divine energy in the womb of his mother Mary, Jesus took upon himself genuine, unfallen humanity. And he lived a life so stunningly more like ours than we tend to acknowledge. So I'd like to spend just a moment, and this is kind of a favorite theme of mine, but bear with me if you will, and it's going to relate very, very much to the events before us on Thursday and Friday, the issue that I want to take up here. But, you know, I'd like to think for just a moment about the childhood of Jesus. And interestingly enough, of course, there are silent years, just as there is a silent day here. In other words, there are years in Jesus' life, many of them, from the time Jesus as an infant is taken back to Nazareth after the Egypt episode until Jesus goes to be baptized by John, the record is silent, save for the Luke 2 remarkably important experience. But Luke 2, when Jesus is taken at the age of 12, he goes up with his parents at the age of 12 to the temple for Passover. But I'm not going to go there. I'm going to go to another passage which I think is hugely important, because let's just think for a moment, and I'm actually taking you somewhere. I know this is a huge, again, I'm the Wizard of Wonder, and so let me wander off into something just for a moment. The Rabbi of Rabbit Trails is a good friend, Bob King used to call me, but it really is germane. So let me just talk about his childhood. The growing years, from infancy until the time he went off to be to participate in he went off to the Passover with his parents at the age of 12. And you know, there are a lot of stories, and I'm going to say this firmly, that there are a lot of extra biblical, apocryphal, by that I mean that they're written in books which do not belong in the Bible and have never been in the Bible, but there are, I don't want to confuse you there. I know that a few were selected, but I'm talking about books that nobody ever claimed to be in the Bible, written late, written by, with a huge Gnostic influence. And if that means nothing to you, suffice it to say that the Gnostics were very dualistic. They rejected the idea, they insisted that the physical was evil. And so they very much rejected the idea of God taking upon himself a body, a real body. And so they despise the doctrine of Jesus' humanity. And there are books which were produced basically out of that community and with that influence, which tell tales about Jesus when he was a boy. And he's a wonder boy. He's doing all sorts of miracles and tricking. Now, some of these stories are a little innocuous. Like there's a story about Jesus with some of his friends, and this is rather famous. It actually shows up in the Quran as well. But but it's a story about Jesus as a boy, 7, 8 years old, and he and some of his friends are taking mud or clay and crafting little animals and so on, and Jesus is crafting beautiful little doves, and the boy Jesus with his fellows are taking those little animals and setting them on a rock to dry and so on. Somebody comes along and tells them, this is Sabbath, you can't do this on Sabbath, and all the other boys are embarrassed. But Jesus, of course, rather defiantly takes his little clay dove that he has fashioned and various stories, but puts it in his hand and breathes on it, and the dove takes flight, and off it flies. Now listen, that didn't happen. That's a fable that is absolute. Not only is it untrue, unhistorical, but it really is offensive, because it misses what the Bible says about the boy Jesus. Now, I'm just going to leave it there, but suffice it to say, though we do not have a literary record of these years, we have a literary reflection, which I think is huge. And I'm going to go here. I'm going to take the time. It's in Luke chapter 4. I've mentioned this passage before, beginning in verse 16, and it's hugely important. Oops, I'm in Matthew 4. Let me go to, no, that's where I want to be, but I'm going to go to Luke chapter 4. And this is the story, and I want you to see it. Oh, I got to put it on the screen for you. I'm sorry. No, it is on the screen by my lights as I see it here. But at any rate, this is Jesus early in his Galilean ministry. It's about a year after his baptism, but at 8 months to a year. Chronology is difficult in that early portion of Jesus' ministry, but and it's important to understand that this is after the initial miracle recorded in John 2. It's some weeks after that. It's also, importantly, after the first cleansing of the temple in John chapter 2. And thus, Jesus has made a name for himself. And Luke tells a story about when Jesus, early in his Galilean ministry, having been gone from Nazareth now for several months, that is, all right, he comes back to Nazareth. I don't want to get too deeply into the story. I'm too tempted to do that. But I want you to notice the way the story begins, where Luke says he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up. Now, Luke's trying to make a point here. And then he goes further and he says, as his custom was, he went to the synagogue. He went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Now, I know that this is often read to mean that it was his habit to go to the synagogue on Sabbath. That seems to be what it's saying, but I really don't think that's what it's saying. For what it's worth, it can be read a little differently, and I think it makes a lot more sense in every way, culture and context. So I think this would be better read as he went on the Sabbath. Back up. On the Sabbath day, he went to the synagogue that it was his custom to go to. Now, the point is that there was, now again, I trust you know that the synagogue is not a temple. There are no sacrifices there. There's only one temple, that's in Jerusalem. It's not a church. That's yet to come. A synagogue was a gathering place, a synagoge, where you come together. That's what the word means. And the synagogue had become, somewhere in the intertestamental period, the 400 years before Christ, the synagogue had become absolutely the center of Jewish life. You had your own synagogue. And as a matter of fact, houses and neighborhoods tended to cluster around a synagogue simply because there were 3 times a week, Saturday, Monday, and Thursday, when the scriptures would be publicly read. And this was pretty much your access to the scriptures in that oral culture. You didn't own your own copies. I know there's some discussion. They may have been more readily available than we've appreciated before, but clearly your primary access to scripture was to go and attend the synagogue services. And the point is that there were restrictions as to how far you could walk on Shabbat. There was a Sabbath day's journey concept. And so it was pretty universally acknowledged and obeyed. It was rabbinical rather than Mosaic, but it certainly colored the culture. And so you would cluster your homes around the synagogue so that you could make your way to synagogue on Saturday morning. Now, I say that just to make this point, that the synagogue was the center of your life. And it wasn't just a place where you go to pray or read the scriptures. It was a place where you would go to hear the latest news, to perhaps find a job, perhaps catch up on any gossip, or to find a spouse for your child, or it was the center of life. Now, another function of the synagogue was that was where the boys under the age of 12, under the age of, if you don't mind, the bar mitzvah age, I should say, were trained in Torah. There was always, the synagogue had a room generally, and many of the synagogues that have been discovered, this is true, called the Beit Midrash, or the house of learning, and that's where the young boys would be trained. So it was very much the center of life. Nazareth is a small village. He goes back to Nazareth, where he had been reared. Most everybody in Nazareth knew everybody else. They lived, and by the way, you generally lived your whole life out in the village where you were born, and then the next generation after you. And so Jesus returns to Nazareth, and then he goes to the synagogue where it was his custom. This is his family synagogue. This is where he had grown up. This was the synagogue it was his custom to go to. Now, so what? What that means is that these are the people who know Jesus better than anybody else on earth knows him. Nobody knows Jesus, Yeshua ben Yosef. Nobody knows this remarkable son of Joseph better than these Nazarenes. They had known him. Now remember, by now he's 30 years of age. He's about 31 by this time, because he had gone to be baptized just before his 30th birthday. That's Luke 3. And now, just several months later, he has, since the baptism, there's been the 40 days of fasting and the temptation and the recuperation for another month or so. And then, of course, Jesus had begun his ministry, and you've had the changing of water to wine, and you've had the cleansing of the Passover, and then Jesus ministering a long time beside John. So that's been going on now. He comes back to Nazareth, to the people who know him better than anybody else on earth. And I'll just tell the story quickly. I love this story, but what happens is simply this, that by reason of the protocols of the synagogue, on those 3 days a week, Saturday, Monday, and Thursday, you would get out the Torah scrolls, and the rabbi would stand at a special podium constructed to keep the scroll from being damaged or even blurred in any way. And he would read a given portion of the Torah, and then he would roll the scroll up, hand it back to the keeper, and he would sit down in Moses' seat to teach. He always stood to read, sat to teach, sat down to teach. But then, after the reading of the Torah passage, the Moses passage, there would be a passage from elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures called the prophets, anywhere in the rest of the Hebrew scriptures. And that portion would be read. And if somebody were in the synagogue that morning, or you just wanted to honor somebody who was regular in the synagogue, you'd ask that person to read that portion and then dilate on it, just talk about it. And because this local boy made good, this remarkable man, Jesus, we knew all of his life, and now he's gone off and rather made a name for himself. And so now he comes back, and there's a great deal of excitement. And he is, in fact, just as it says here, he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah. So he stood to read, and he read one of the most messianic passages of the Old Testament, Isaiah 61. I think it was probably the passage that had been, it was a lectionary, and the synagogues around everywhere were reading that passage. But however you take that, he is handed the scroll, he reads this passage, and then notice verse 20, he closed the book, that is the scroll, he gave it back to the attendant, and he sat down. This is what you do. So now it's time for him to teach. And it says the eyes of all who were in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, verse 21, and here is his whole sermon. Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Now, we'll reference this story a little later in a different context, but this is his whole sermon. And what he is saying is, I am the fulfillment of that scripture. Jesus is laying claim before the townspeople of Nazareth, whom he has known all of his life. He is laying claim to be the Messiah. And there's nobody in the room who misunderstood this. They knew the stories of what had happened and so on just recently with the cleansing of the temple and so on. And so he lays claim to messiahship. Now watch this. This is what I want you to see. All bore witness to him and marveled at the gracious words which proceeded out of his mouth. They were stunned. And look at this. And they said, we knew there was something different about this kid ever since he blew on those little clay doves and they flew away this morning. Now, you got the text in front of you. Is that what they said? Did they say, we knew there was something different? No, you know what they said? Is not this Joseph's son? Do you hear what they're saying? They're saying, what's going on here? What's going on? This is Joseph's son. We know this boy. Now, I won't take you there, but if you go to Matthew 13, 55, Matthew 13, about verse 55, Jesus returns at the end of his Galilean ministry, about 18 months later, to Nazareth once again. Now, he had moved to Capernaum. I want to talk about that. He had moved to Capernaum, but he returns to Nazareth. And once again, when he does miracles, not many because of their unbelief, but their reaction is, what is going on? This is Joseph's son. So what I'm going to say to you, and the reason I spend the time, and maybe more time than I intended, but please understand this, folks, that given this passage, if there's one word you have to write over Jesus' childhood, and I would say Jesus' entire growing years, from its infancy up until the time he went off to be baptized, if there's one word to write over the entire course of Jesus' life, which these Nazarenes had carefully witnessed and been part of, if there's one word to write over Jesus' life, it's this word, normal. So normal that had you grown up in Nazareth, had you known him all of your life, when he made the claim to be Messiah, you were staggered. That's the testimony. So that's what I want to get out of this passage, that Jesus lived a life so stunningly like ours. It was a real life. Now, I like to say that clearly, and all of those stories about a wonder-working super Jesus who did all these little signs, and some of them are so offensive that make make you choke. I mean, some of those apocryphal stories about him striking people dead and so on. But the fact is that all of those stories are lies. They are myths. They are fables. And they are fables which totally distort. As you start thinking of Jesus as a wonder boy, he's not living a real life, and he did live a real life. Now, let me go a step further, and because just very quickly, one of the other dynamics of the record. Now, I mean, I think the record is so explicitly clear that Jesus lived a real life, and we have him growing and learning and asking questions and setting out to do something and being frustrated and having to back up and lay a new plan. All of that's explicit in the record. The narrative could not be more clear. But then I think beyond that, you have implicit, such as there in the story in Luke chapter 4, implicit, strong evidence and indications that Jesus lived a life so much like ours. Now, I like to say that as a boy, Jesus probably did some amazing things. For instance, if late one afternoon his mother Mary came out and said, Jesus, it's time to pick up your toys and come in, I think Jesus certainly did an amazing thing. You know, are you ahead of me on this? He picked up his toys and came in. So he was the sweetest, most obedient, most insightful, precocious young man. I think some of those people in Nazareth who had known him all of his life maybe were still a little, some of the fellows were a little resentful, over what he did to the learning or the grading curve in synagogue school. I'm kidding, but so the point is that Jesus lived a real normal life. And secondly, very quickly, there is absolutely, well, let me say, first of all, that because he lived out those 30 years in Nazareth, he certainly, as he grew up, until you were bar mitzvahed, you were a boy. And you had chores, and you played, and you ran, and you maybe went to, you spent some time in synagogue school. You were a boy. Once you were bar mitzvahed, and this is the point of bar mitzvah, one of the most important ones. Once you were bar mitzvahed, you apprenticed yourself to your father. You know, you didn't spend a lot of time trying to figure out in those days and in those villages what you were going to be when you grew up. You're going to do what your father does. And if you're a woman, of course, you're going to raise a family like your mother did. And so Jesus, I think, clearly would have been apprenticed to his father. I think this is what Luke 12:51 means when it says, I'm sorry, Luke 2:51, when it says that after the learning experience there at the temple, when Jesus went back with his parents, said he went down and was subject to them. And I think primarily that probably is a reference to the fact that, as did every other boy after his bar mitzvah, Jesus became an apprentice to his father. Now, I mentioned before, and I got some question about it, that I think very possibly Jesus was a stonemason. And the reason for that is that there are two times, once in Matthew 15 and again in Mark 6, and they're both the same context, where, see if I have it here, I thought I did. No, it's in Matthew 13. I always get that wrong. This is Matthew 13. It's that passage that I mentioned before, and I misidentified it. Not Matthew 15, but Matthew 13, where Jesus returns to Nazareth. But here they say, is not this the carpenter's son? And you have the same thing in Mark chapter 6. Is that this, the bottom there, the carpenter? Matter of fact, there he is called, is he not himself the carpenter? So matter of fact, I should point that out. Help me here now, in Luke, yes, in Matthew 13, I was confused. In Matthew 13, they say, is not this the carpenter's son? In Mark 6, very, very similarly, but here they say, right here, is not this the carpenter? So he himself was known as a carpenter. Now, let me just point out to you that the word carpenter here, and I'll call it up just because I can, the word carpenter is tekton or tectone. And it means, it's where we get our word technology. But actually what it means is builder or artificer. Now listen, there is early remembrance of Jesus from the 3rd century, 200s, as a carpenter, working in wood. And but this is the whole argument, and it's not very important. But I rather think that Jesus was a stonemason. The word tecton means primarily builder, and anybody who goes to Israel, this realization dawns upon them forcefully. In Israel, you don't build with wood. You never have built very much with wood. Now, they used to have more forested hillsides than they do today, and they're working better than any country in the world. Israel is the only country in the world that had more trees on their land at the end of the 20th century than they did at the beginning of the 20th century. And they've used, but the point is, they grow stick lumber. They don't grow beam lumber. David had to go to Lebanon to find that, to the mountains of Lebanon. So honest to goodness, you build with what is around you, and every indication is that they have always built with stone. And so I think very possibly Joseph was a stonemason, and he would have apprenticed to Jesus as a stonemason. And I think Jesus spent 18 years from the age of 12 to the age of 30. Those are the only two chronological notations that we have in the 4 Gospels. I'm sorry about Jesus' actual age at a given point. And we're told that he was about 12. He had turned 12 when he went to Jerusalem with his parents. And then we're told that he was 30 about to turn 30 when he went to be baptized by John. So for those 18 years, Jesus had worked, first of all, as an apprentice. And this takes me to my second point, my other point, and I've spent too much time, but let me be quick with this. Folks, there's every reason to believe, every compelling, undeniable, it seems to me, reason to believe that sometime between those two events, sometime after Luke 2 and before Luke 3, when Jesus goes off to be baptized, somewhere in those 18 years, Jesus' adopted father, Joseph, passed away. We don't know why. I know that there is the tradition, and I think there's an agenda here, that it was because he was older and so on. I don't think so at all. I think they probably were a standard young couple. There are a lot of reasons that a person might die. Those years are entirely silent. So whether it was an accident, whether it was an illness, whatever it was, for some reason, and we say that because the last time Joseph appears in the record is there in Luke chapter 2, when he and Mary take Jesus up to the temple for Passover. And then, beginning with Jesus' baptism and all the way through his ministry and all the way up to his ascension, Jesus' family enters the record a number of times, and very significant times. I like to trace the times at which Jesus' family intersects the record. Joseph is never part of that record. He's always absent. And there are events, and I won't go through them, but there are events where Jesus interacts with his family. And goodness, if Joseph were yet alive, he'd not only be there, he would be taking leadership. And then, of course, on the cross, as we're going to talk about on Friday, Jesus turns his mother over to John. Clearly, that's because his mother is a widow. So let me just say again, and there really is no question about this, that somewhere during those silent years between Luke 2 and Luke 3, between Jesus at 12 and Jesus at 30, somewhere Joseph dies. We don't know at what point, but here's the point. And this is really implicitly clear in the record. When that happened, by reason of culture and by reason of Mosaic requirement, the eldest son would step into the role of leadership in that family. And that eldest son is Jesus. And some have made much of the fact that Jesus did not marry. Well, that was not aberrational in that culture. And anybody who says it is has an axe to grind, has a point to make. And I think generally a wicked point. But it wasn't all that aberrational for a man to remain single. But the reality is that Jesus had a family, and he raised that family, and he felt a responsibility for that family. And so I think for all those years, and I don't know how many, Jesus gave himself to plowing in to the spiritual growth of his half siblings, of his brothers and sisters. And, it's a curious thing, real quickly. Everybody who studies the book of James, and James, of course, almost everybody believes, I do, was written by Jesus' half brother, James. And everybody who studies that book recognizes a very unstudied or a non-deliberate relationship to the Sermon on the Mount. In other words, it just kind of bleeds the same spirit, the same rhythm, the same focus on trees, the same focus on nature, the same use of illustrations. And in so many ways, the book of James just kind of echoes silently the Sermon on the Mount. Well, the Sermon on the Mount is the most extensive record we have of Jesus' teaching. And think about it. How many days did Jesus sit in the middle of the day when you stop and so on? How many times did he sit his siblings down, say, okay, our lesson today? And he started through the scriptures and teaching his, and maybe little James began to squirm and say, come on, Jesus, let's go play. And Jesus said, no, you sit right there, James, I'm not done. But at any rate, the point is, now James grows up, he gets saved, he writes a book, and don't you know, it sounds just like his brother, big brother Jesus. I really think that's there. But we can be sure that Jesus took over the training of his siblings. I think he probably apprenticed his other brothers. We don't know when Joseph died, but very possibly early enough that Jesus was part of the apprenticeship. That is, he did the apprenticing of his brothers, and he probably, perhaps he had at least a couple of sisters, and it was up to the father, the family, to arrange the marriage. And Jesus very possibly was very much a part of working with the other family and arranging for his sisters to be married and so on. So the point is that it's so, I think, helpful to understand that explicitly in the record, and I say explicitly, clearly in the record, Jesus would have spent several years as a stonemason. I think stonemason, and by the way, there are two elements of the narrative of Jesus' life that reflect the fact that he was a very, very virile, strong man. For one thing, he survived 40 days of fasting. He ate nothing for just short of 6 weeks, and that is, very few people could survive that. And number two, in the garden, he's going to sweat great drops of blood, which is, again, bespeaks an emotional trauma that very few people could survive. He was physically very strong, and I think it was a function of his those years that he spent as a stonemason. But I want to take you one other place, and that is, and I'm not finding it here, so I'm just going to go there. Matthew chapter 4 and verse 13, because notice what it says here. This is the beginning of the Galilean ministry, but all I want you to catch is what's in yellow. It says, leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum. Now, the point is that Jesus, before he began his public ministry, he moved from Nazareth, which was terribly, terribly inappropriate and unstrategic as a headquarters for his itinerant ministry, because it was very hard to get to him. Once you climbed up that hill to get there, you just had to go back down the hill to get anywhere else. So that's where Jesus was reared, in Nazareth, on the top of the Nazareth Ridge overlooking the Jezreel Valley. But now he moves his family some 8 or 10 miles to the north and a little bit east, right on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, to a city called Capernaum. This is hugely strategic. Capernaum was the center of all, it was one of the seats of taxation. And so the roads were crafted and kept maintained so that no matter who you were, or where you were coming from, the road would be well paved to get you into Capernaum, because that's where all the caravans and all the merchants had to go first to pay their tolls. You had, as soon as you crossed over to the region of Herod Antipas, coming from the north, you had to pay your toll. So the point is that Capernaum was tremendously strategic. And I'm going to take the time, just because I like to share it. I may have to cheat on a couple of other things, and we can do it on Saturday. But I'm going to take the time to say, I think there's one other reason that Capernaum is so strategic. Because not only is it the perfect headquarters for an itinerant ministry, because the roads, he's going to 3 different times in the book of Luke, Jesus goes on what we call his missionary journeys, but they're where he goes out, and Luke simply says he went from village to village, preaching in every synagogue, healing all that came in unto him, and preaching the gospel of the kingdom. So Jesus is going to saturate the land of Galilee for 18 months. And to do that, he's hugely advantaged. And I say again, it's a very unusual thing to leave the village of your youth. But here Jesus, and we have the same thing in John 2 and verse 12, where they go down with his family and makes much of it. And again, they leave Nazareth and go to Capernaum. And so it's strategic to his itinerant ministry, proclaiming himself the Messiah. But here's another thing. And I think this is so big. You see, as I mentioned before, number one, our faith is grounded in real history. And those historical truth claims upon which we have made dependent the eternal safekeeping of our soul spirit, those historical truth claims of the Gospels are pretty bizarre, including this man who's doing all these miracles. And then he's going to be crucified and come alive from the tomb 3 days later. And the reason you believe that is eyewitness. I can't overemphasize that. Eyewitness. Well, think about this. Jesus moves his family to Capernaum. Now, as I said yesterday, if you're coming from afar with someone you'd like to see healed, you're going to go to Capernaum and you're going to wait there. And it's really kind of stunning, the disproportionate number of miracles in the Gospels, which are specifically identified as having happened in Capernaum. And I think it was in large part because that's where people would come, and that Jesus would always return. And Capernaum becomes, by the way, known as his town. So he returned to his town. His hometown, it was Bethlehem, where he was born, if you want to say, the town of his youth, and the town, it was Nazareth. That's where he lived out his life. But now his town is Capernaum. But I think there's tremendous apologetic strategy in this. Because think about it. As I say, all the trade, and it is massive every day. This is a narrow spot on the international highway called the Fertile Crescent, and Pax Romana trade is exploding. So all of this caravan traffic, all of these merchants and so on, they're always traveling at least in small caravans, because you have to protect yourself and you take a security force. But here you come, and maybe you're just traveling with them. You don't have anything to trade, but you want to get from Damascus to Cairo. And so you're on your way, and you paid the wagon master just like you want to go west in early days of our country. But you're coming along, and as soon as you cross over into the territory of Herod Philip, they're just north of the Sea of Galilee, you make your way around the corner, just about 2 miles, and everything stops because you got to go in. The wagon master has to go in and pay his tolls. Now that's going to take a couple of hours. So you're just traveling. You're traveling with them for safety's sake, but you're going to have to stop with them. So maybe you go find a place under a tree, or find a place where there's some locals congregated, and you go and get yourself something a cup of coffee, who in the world knows, and then you make your way, and then you just sit down somewhere to be comfortable. And while you're sitting there, and I'm making this up, but just imagine, while you're sitting there, you watch this guy, and he's got his family behind him, and they're jumping in the air, and he's running along. He's got these crutches, and he's waving them as an arm. I can walk. And he watches, he takes those crutches, breaks them over the knee, throws, and they run off, and oh, he can walk. And you turn to the guy next to you. He's a local. And you say, what is that all about? And he says, well, you're not going to believe this, but there's this fella. His name is Yeshua. He lived all his life in Nazareth, quiet. We never heard of him. And some months ago, we heard some excitement, but he moved his family here to Capernaum. And I'm telling you, people come here because if you can get to that wonder worker, he heals you. And you say, no, I don't believe that for a minute. And the local guy says, well, I'm telling you, I see that guy with the crutches. I've known him all my life. He's been lame all of his life. I don't know how to explain that other than that this man, his name is Jesus, he healed him. All right, now, Wagon Master's done. You join the troop, the caravan. You make your way all the way to Cairo. You're living in Cairo. Maybe 15, 20 years later, a fellow shows up. He's got a book tucked up under his arm. And he takes it out, and he calls everybody together. I want to read something to you. You sit under the big bay tree in the middle of town, and he opens it, and he begins to read, and it's the Gospel of Matthew. And he begins to read the gospel and all of these miracles and so on. And the people around you say, come on, that didn't happen. What are you going to say? You say, I'm telling you, I was in Capernaum. I just happened to be there. This guy told me, he insisted that isn't a play act. That guy was lame. I think there's something to this, because I was eyewitness to a man who was healed by Jesus. So I'm saying that Capernaum, Jesus moving to Capernaum was hugely strategic, because it provided a means by which the truth of Jesus' claims could be, the eyewitness testimony could be salt and peppered all across the Mediterranean world, because there's nowhere in the world to which a caravan I can't finish that sentence. Every place in the world, there's a caravan coming through there that's on the way to that place. So I'm going to way back to it. I've wandered egregiously, but I want you to see that, and here's my whole point, by the way, I almost missed it, that when Jesus moved from Nazareth to Capernaum, he took his family with him. Now this is huge, because again, you stay in the village, but it's only because, I'm way back to my original point, that Jesus, after his father died, would have stepped into the role of leadership. And you see it because Jesus, when he goes to Capernaum to initiate his public ministry, he takes his family, and that's a big deal in that culture. And again, when he comes back to town, his family is there to greet him. So I'm saying that clearly Jesus, he knows what it is to raise a family. And I'm going to tell you something else. Do you think Jesus loved his physical family, his half-siblings and his mother, any less than you love your family? Oh, he cared for that family. Now, I'm going to come back to that later, but I spent 45 minutes and that did not mean to do it. But let me go quickly to a different issue, if you will. And that is, and these are background, and that is the issue of the day of the crucifixion. Now, listen, I'm going to be very brief here, but I'm going to say that there are three positions. There are those, and this is an intramural, fraternal discussion. There is no heresy involved here, no matter what position you take. Everybody who takes whatever position believes in a high view of Scripture. So this is entirely fraternal, and I understand. I'm going to explain in just a moment why there's some confusion. There's really only one reason for the confusion, because you see, every indication in the Scriptures is that he died on Friday, and it's really compelling indication, but there is a problem, and the problem is one verse, Matthew 12 and verse 40, where Jesus says that as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, even so would he, Jesus, be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, it's that phrase, 3 days and 3 nights. It occurs once in the Gospels and once with reference to Jesus burial in the tomb. And there are a couple of other times where he says, you're going to get nothing but the sign of the prophet Jonah. And maybe you could find that same thing there. But as far as explicit reference, the 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb is only in Matthew 12:40. Now, against that, let me just say that there are, I believe, about 42 times where the Bible says that Jesus would rise on the third day. That phrase, on the third day, is about 42 times. This is what Jesus told his disciples. I'm going to go to Jerusalem, suffer many things with the chief priests and scribes, and be killed. On the third day, I'll rise again. These are the two guys on the road to Emmaus. Haven't you heard that it's now the third day since these things happened? And by the same token, this is Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. I preached unto you the gospel, that Jesus died according to the scriptures, that he was buried and rose again on the third day. So we believe the Bible. It's inerrant in all of its parts. So we're not going to choose between these two. We're going to say they both mean the same thing. He was only in the tomb once, and at one point he describes it as being in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights. Elsewhere, it's described as having been buried and then arisen on the third day. What are you going to do with that? Well, and I could take it to passages. And by the way, there is a document, and I'm going to throw it up here on the screen for you. There is a document which is in that, I put it in that just this morning, actually, in that Dropbox, to which you can go to find some of these things. And it's a chart concerning the day on which Jesus was crucified. And what I've tried to do here is give the arguments. Here's the Wednesday. Some believe it was Wednesday because they want a full 72 hours. There are problems with it. It's not as popular today, but there are those who believe it, and people who believe the Bible and who are as much smarter than I am. Okay, so I'm not trying to grab any high ground, but I reject this. I don't think he died on Wednesday, and I try and give you the arguments for and against, and I give you some of those who held to it. Now, the big one other than Friday is clearly Thursday, and this is very popular, and you'll hear it. I have good friends. I'll tell you something. I was taught Thursday. That is, I was taught that Jesus died on Thursday when I went to seminary, Central Seminary, Minneapolis, and I believed it. And when I was first assigned teaching the life of Christ, I taught Thursday for some time. So I'm just saying I came to a different position, but I'm not disparaging this. There are many good men who believe Thursday. On the other hand, I would embrace the Friday crucifixion. Now, I give you two charts here, but the first one is what's of interest to us. I'll come back to the other one. And I have the chart up. You can read it yourself, but I just want to make one point, and I'm shortchanging this, but and let me say too that the week will work no matter where you put the crucifixion. So you can adjust things and so on, and that relates to the point I'm going to come to next very quickly. But here's the problem. What do you do with the fact that so many times it says he rose on the third day, and yet he says in Matthew 12 to the Pharisees that he's going to be in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights. Well, there is a very famous quotation. It is oft appealed to because I think it helps so. I have it here. It's kind of small on the screen, but it's under my letter D, and right here. And it's a quote from a rabbi. It's in the Talmud, but it purports to be a quote from a man. It's very early. It's a very, very early quotation, close to the time of Jesus. And the rabbi is not talking about how long Jesus was in the tomb. He's not talking about anything Christian. He is simply trying to explain how the Jewish people use the language. And he's making the point that there is a figure of speech, if you don't mind, a Hebraism that you have to understand. And here it is right here. He says, a day and a night are an ona. Now, what he means by that is, it's one unit. And then he says this, the portion of an ona is as the whole of it. So when we talk about a day and night, we're not talking about 24 hours. We're not talking about two separate periods of light and dark. We're just talking about a unit, and any portion is as the whole of it. And so I think it's important to understand they didn't wear wristwatches. They didn't keep the kind of careful time that we do. That not because they were so primitive and untutored. They didn't need to. And I just always rebel against the idea that they were unintelligent. So that's not the point at all. But the cycle of their lives did not demand that. And so But the point is, what the rabbi is saying is that when we use the phrase day night, we don't mean necessarily 24 hours or two distinguishable periods of light and dark. We just mean a unit, and any portion of the unit is as the whole of it. So here's the point. Jesus dies on Friday. And by the way, well, let me make this point first of all. He's in the tomb for several hours, first several hours on Friday. So he dies at 3 o'clock, and so he's in 3 or 4 hours in the tomb, and that's an ona. That's a portion. That's a day night. Then all of Saturday, and then as the sun goes down, the first day of week, and sometime before dawn on the first day of the week, Jesus resurrects, and so he's there on Sunday. So that's part of Friday, all of Saturday, part of Sunday. And I would argue that to the Jewish mind, that is 3 days and 3 nights. And it is also the third day. Now, 2 other points real quickly. Number one, much is made of the fact that the Bible says it was the preparation of the Sabbath week, or the preparation, well, that's what it says, preparation for Sabbath or of the Sabbath week. And out of that comes the idea of 2 Sabbaths in this week. And I know, and much is made of the fact that several times the word Sabbath is plural. I realize that, but you have to understand, don't get started on this, Bookman, but there is a Hebrew literary device. I got to tell you, Hebrew was written, the Bible was written for an oral culture. And for that reason, matter of fact, we talked about this back there in Luke 13. And we said that whatever you want of nuance, you have to insinuate it into the words on the page, the actual text. And we appeal to that with regard to that today, tomorrow, and the day following, that numeric progression that indicates fullness. Where there's another literary device, it's called the plural of majesty. And when you use a noun, when you refer to something that is majestic, that is special, you often use the plural. Even though it's a singular noun, it takes singular antecedents and adverbs and so on, but you use the noun, you put it in the plural. Thus the word Elohim. Eim is plural. And there are places where that word Elohim with a small e, if you don't mind, or small g is translated gods, plural. But every time it refers to Yahweh, it's always God. Well, why would you use a plural noun of God, who is one God? Because it's the plural of majesty, and you can, in the text, communicate the fact that this is a special. Well, half the time, the Sabbath was the special day, and about half the time that word is used, both Old and New Testament, it's used in plural. So when it's referring to one, so it's hard to make anything definitive out of the fact that there are plural forms of the word Sabbath. I don't think it'll work. Others do. And again, I get the microphone, forgive me, but I'm just trying to say, I realize. And the other point is this Friday of Passover. So they'll say it was the preparation of Passover. That must mean that it was I won't get into the argument, but that term is used. And it becomes part of the argument generally for Thursday. Well, understand this, that the Jews do not name the days of the week, they number them. Sabbath means 7th. Jesus rose on the first day of the week. That's the name of the week. The first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day. Preparation day. The one day of the week which is given a name is Friday. And it's called preparation because whatever you want on Saturday, by rabbinical law today, you can't flip a light switch on Saturday, because the Bible says that you're not supposed to start a fire and there's a spark in that light switch, and so you can't flip a light switch. So whatever light you want to have on anytime throughout the whole cycle of the Sabbath, from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday, you have to turn that light on Friday. Now that's pretty easy, but if you want to eat anything, you have to cook it on Friday. If you want to have a feast at the going out of the Sabbath, you have to prepare that on Friday. So Friday is the day, and you see this in Israel today when things begin to shut down and people begin to move to the places where they're going to stay for the Sabbath and so on, and they're making preparation for the Sabbath. When it simply says, when it says that it was the preparation of Sabbath week, it just means that Sabbath, the week could cycle. The week was basically 7 days, beginning with the 15th, the day of unleavened bread, preceded by the slaughter of the lamb on the 14th. But somewhere in there was going to be a Friday, And so it simply say it was Friday, and then it's in the context of they wanted to take the bodies down because it was Friday of Passover week, which means, it doesn't say Friday, it was preparation, but it's our Friday of Passover week, and therefore tomorrow's the Sabbath, and that's all it's saying. So forgive me. I want you to know that obviously throughout this series I am teaching a Friday crucifixion. It's not because I think anybody believes anything else is heretical or wrong. No, this is what I believe, and but I want you to know: A, it's an irenic discussion. B, the Passion Week can be reconstructed no matter where you put it. Now, I will say one other thing, and this is kind of big with me, and that is this: that every indication we have is that when a man died, and I talked about this when we were talking about Lazarus. When a person died, you could attend to his body for 3 days. And the days began when he died. So if he died early in the morning, late at night, didn't matter. That is before the sun, whatever, that's day one. And then you can attend to his body that day, the second day, but at the sundown on the third day, you roll the stone across the tomb and you can no longer attend to his body. And the reason for that, as I said, is the smell. So the point is, those women were going out on Sunday morning to attend to the body. And I think it's significant. If Jesus dies on Friday, that's day one. Saturday is day two. Sunday, the body is still available. If he dies any earlier than that, if crucifixion is on Thursday, that's day one. Day two is Friday. Day three is Saturday. It wouldn't have been, the body would not have been available on Sunday morning. So I think there are all sorts of indications, and I've kind of beat that to death, that issue, but I'm going to leave that and move quickly. I'm a little late, but quickly to another issue, and that relates very much to where I'm headed and where I want to conclude. And it also relates to the discussion we just had, and that is this idea of Silent Wednesday. Now, again, the outline that we're using and what we're talking about today, there is a day which is silent. Doesn't mean that it's not busy. It just means that the record skips it from Tuesday night by my lights to Thursday afternoon, which we're going to pick up tomorrow morning in our lesson. Now, there are those who believe in a Monday triumphal entry. And some important voices, and especially at this season of the year, have argued for this, and that's fine. Again, this is totally an intramural discussion. I believe in Palm Sunday, but there are those who believe that the triumphal entry was on Monday. And one of the most important of those is a man named Harold Hoehner. And Harold Hoehner, bless his heart, I have his book right here, I can reach for it, wrote a book called Chronological Aspects of the Life of Christ. He was my professor. He was the head of my doctoral program. I love the man. He's going to be with Jesus. This is a very important book, but I'm going to take umbrage with it on a couple of counts. And first of all is this, that he does quietly, he doesn't spend a lot of time with it, but he puts the triumphal entry on Monday. And then there are others as well who have embraced this. And I'm just going to say, I think there are two arguments, and I'm going to try and respond to those arguments. Hoehner, now he doesn't make much of this in the book, but I took the class from him and responded to that position actually in a paper, and he gave me an A in the paper, but he didn't agree with me, he didn't change his mind. But the point is that his big argument was that it seemed so strange to him that there would be a week that is skipped in the record, because you do have, as I said to you before, you have such a tight record. You have 2/5 of each of the four Gospels given to this week, and we have so much detail. Why would they skip a whole? Well, frankly, I'm not very troubled by that, because number one, well, I might say this, that you've got at least a half day skipped at any rate, because if you move, and understand, and I can give it to you here, that's what I have before, but understand that if you move the triumphal entry to Monday, then you have, I'll just use this. Now, this is what my chart with triumphal entry on Sunday. But if you move the triumphal entry here, if you move forward a day to Monday and take this out, then you're going to have the triumphal entry on Monday, and then you're going to have the time in the temple that we talked about yesterday I'm sorry, you're going to have the cleansing of the temple on Tuesday, and then you're going to have the confrontations that we talked about yesterday on Wednesday. So that's the configuration. And but my point is, no matter what you do, the record jumps at least from late Wednesday night. If you take this configuration, then from late Wednesday night to mid-afternoon on Thursday, so you've got a gap at any rate, is the point. And the other point to be made is this: this is where I'm going to head in just a moment. I don't think that I think it's hard to maintain the coherency of the story if you don't have that day. Now, the other argument that's used, I skipped this, and I should mention it quickly, and this, Hoehner does appeal to this, and others do as well, and this means a great deal to many. Frankly, it's not as compelling to me, for better or for worse, but the point is that if you take, let me go back there. Let me go back to that chart, and I've made a mess of it now, but the point is that if you put, let's do this. Friday is Nisan 14, begins on Thursday sundown, but let's say Friday is Nisan 14. If you use this chart, if the triumphal entry is here, that's Nisan 10, and Nisan 10 is the day when the lamb was to be brought and presented to the priest. And so it's rather evocative in terms of typology or spiritual application to regard the triumphal entry as the presentation of the lamb. And that should happen on Nisan 10. And that's important to a lot of people. Now, I'm going to say that number one, and I'm arguing to my point, obviously, but number one, I don't see much of a parallel. The triumphal entry is, he's not offering himself as a lamb, he's offering himself as a king. There is nothing, now you can say, well, we know from theology that's the Lamb of God. All right, but as far as what's going on, and folks, let me just tell you something. Well, for what it's worth, just full disclosure, my mind tends toward the mundane. In other words, rather than some sort of mystical, and it's often there, but I'm asking, what happened on that day? What is going on in the record on that day? And what were people to understand was going on that day? And I think Jesus was presenting himself as Messiah King. And the furthest thing from their mind was that he was offering himself as a suffering, dying lamb. So I'm not looking for that. And besides that, I shouldn't perhaps get into this, but I'm a little, I think there's some confusion. What the Bible says, what the Old Testament says specifically, and it's in Exodus, only in Exodus, is that for 4 days, the lamb had to be with you. It had to be presented, and then it had to be with you. And those 4 days would take you back to Nisan 10. Now, we'll talk about why that was before. But whether the idea that, so it had to be presented early enough that it could be with you at least for those 4 days. So I'm not sure that Nisan 10 itself, I think it was the deadline, the lamb had to be presented by that time, but I'm not sure all the lambs were presented on Nisan 10. But so I'm going to leave it at that. That's just not a very compelling consideration to me. That is the fact that Nisan 10 becomes a typical fulfillment, or it becomes, typical fulfillment of the demand that the lamb be presented on the 10th of Nisan. Means a lot to a lot of people, and I don't mean to demean it at all. And by the way, well, I can actually have Sunday to be Nisan 10, but I'm not going to try and get into that right now. I'll take you there another time. All right, now. We have looked at Jesus and his family. We've talked about the day of the crucifixion, which I take to be Friday, and tried to build the case. I've tried to make the case that I think Silent Wednesday is just that, and that in point of fact, it's important, but that's where I want to go, and I want to go to the narrative. So I'm a little late, I've been going long, but be with me, stay with me if you can for just a few more minutes. I'm going to we're going to return to the narrative, but I want to return to Tuesday night, because I mentioned to you yesterday that there was an event that occurred on Tuesday night which really sets the scene. So important for the rest of the week. And I want to go there, and it's important on several grounds. But let me take you, it's recorded, and the event is simply this, that Judas sneaks off to the Sanhedrin to Caiaphas. All right, so let me see real quickly. All right, here it is, Matthew 26. Now, what happens is this. I got to be quick. Tuesday night, and as I said, Judas is the only Judean. The other 11 are all Galilean. This is not absolutely set in stone, but every indication, I think and the way it plays out really strengthens it in my mind, that Judas was from Judea, and the others were far away from home. So on Tuesday night, Sunday triumphal entry, Monday cleansing, Tuesday all those confrontations, late in the afternoon, woe unto you scribes and Pharisees. And now Jesus goes back out to Bethany. Along the way, he weeps over the city, preaches the Sermon on the Mount, the Olivet Discourse, and now we find him in Bethany. So that's where he settles in. But after they have settled in, Judas sneaks away. And there is a hill south of Jerusalem. It's never been part of Jerusalem. It's well south of Jerusalem, but it's high and it looks down on the city of Jerusalem. And you can stand there at a place called Haz Promenade. We often do, and kind of view the city of Jerusalem, the walled city from the south. But today it's very much a part of modern Jerusalem. But it's a hill. It's one hill south of the city in Jesus' day, and that's where Caiaphas had his home. Now this is very important. He had two homes because he had a personal home, a villa. It would have been Caiaphas and his clan and generations and so on. And that was on that hill. To this day, it's called the Hill of Evil Counsel, and we'll talk about that. But that's where Caiaphas lived. Caiaphas also had a priestly villa. That is, he had the right to the priestly villa because he was the high priest. And whoever was the high priest could live in the priestly villa. And that's where Jesus is going to be taken very, very late on Thursday night. So to distinguish between the two, here it is Tuesday night. Judas is angry. He sneaks off to the home of Caiaphas, and he makes a bargain, and a plot is laid. Now, that's what we're going to talk about very quickly, and here it is. I'm sorry. I got to go back up here. And I want you to see, this is a fascinating exercise in synoptic gospel criticism, because Matthew tells it the fullest. And it says it came to have, after all these sayings, that's the Olivet Discourse. And then he says, you know that after 2 days is the Passover. So it's Tuesday, Wednesday, and then the Passover. So after 2 days is the Passover. The Passover is 2 days away. And he says that the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. All right. So Jesus is with his disciples. Then Matthew says this in the green. Then the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders of the people. Now, again, that's an unholy trinity. I'm telling you, if you got the chief priests, that's the Sadducees, the scribes, that's the Pharisees, and then others of the Sanhedrin who perhaps don't identify exactly with either party. But the point is that the Jewish leadership, now we've talked about this before, they're very angry. And this is not an official meeting because that couldn't take place in a home, but they assembled at the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas. This is the personal villa down on the hill. And they plotted to take Jesus by trickery and kill him. But they said, listen to this, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. All right, so number one, Matthew says that the 2 days before Tuesday night, they gathered and they took counsel to kill him, but they're throwing their hands in the air. Hear it, and they're saying, we need to get him dead, but not during the feast because there'll be an uproar. Now, very quickly, let me compare this to Mark, because you go to Mark and you have the same thing. It's typically a briefer, but after 2 days, it was the Passover. Matthew had Jesus saying that. Mark simply says it was the Passover. This is Peter. And then it says, the chief priests, the scribes, sought how they might take him by trickery and put him to death. So that's the point. But now, again, you have the same admission of frustration, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. Now, here's where we have to do a bit of an exercise in harmonization, and I really want to make this pertinent to the drama that's before us, but we have to stop just a moment, because in point of fact, let me take you back first of all to Matthew. In both Matthew and Mark, something happens, because right here, now follow me, right here is where the high priest, the Sanhedrin, said, not during the feast. And the story kind of gets suspended. And it seems a little strange at that point, because we know very well he's going to die on the high day of the feast. So maybe we're asking ourselves, if we're reading this for the first time, we're asking ourselves, well, that's strange. Why on Tuesday night late, they're insisting they can't get it done during the feast, and yet it happens on the high day of the feast. I wonder what happened. Glad you asked, because you see what happens is that Matthew stops and tells the story of the feast that we've already talked about, the feast that happened last Saturday, where Jesus was anointed by Mary, and then everybody rebuked Mary, and then Jesus rebuked those who were rebuking her. Now, you know that story, and it's told here, but watch this. This story, which was suspended right here, we're saying, wow, I wonder what happened, is clearly picked up right here. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you? And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver. And from that time, he sought opportunity to betray him. Now, let me point something else out, and I'm going to make my point. Mark does exactly the same thing. You have this reference to the Sanhedrin is saying, oh, nuts, we can't get it done until after the feast. And then the story is sort of suspended, and you have the same story of the feast and the anointing and the rebukes. But then again, it picks up here. Then Judas Iscariot, and he tells us the same thing. Now, here is the harmonizing problem. I'm just going to say it and offer you my solution, the prevailing solution. And the harmonizing problem is why John tells this same story, and it's referenced right here. John tells what is clearly the same story, but he puts it on Saturday night. Remember the going out of the Sabbath? We made much of this, that on the very night when, after the Sabbath was over, they gathered at the home of Simon the leper, and there was the feast. It's the same story. And John puts it squarely on Saturday night. And yet Matthew and Mark, now hear me, tell the same story in the middle of their Tuesday narrative. Now notice what I didn't say. They don't say it happened on Tuesday, but they do interrupt what they're telling you did happen on Tuesday and tell you another story. And I'm back in, let me go back to Matthew first. Notice that in each case, there are two strong indications, and the one I've already made, that this is a flashback, because number one, the story interrupts. That is, the story of the feast is a parenthesis in the middle of the story about Judas going to the Sanhedrinists, because, as I say, we're told right here that the Sanhedrinists are there and they're trying to kill him, but they say not during the feast, and then it's suspended, and it's only down here in verse 14 that the story, and it's exactly the same in Mark. So clearly this is a parenthesis. And the other thing to point out is that there is a time distinction. So he says here in in verse 6 of Matthew, he says, when Jesus was in Bethany. And Mark says something very similar when he says being in Bethany. So here's what I'm telling you, that the feast took place on Saturday night. John puts it there explicitly. Both Matthew and Mark tell the story in the middle of their Tuesday night narrative. And they tell it in this moment of suspended action where, on the one hand, the priests have confessed they can't get it done during the feast. And on the other hand, Judas comes and tells them how they can get it done during the feast. So now I think, with regard to the harmonization, the feast only happened once. It happened on Saturday night, but both Matthew and Mark, for literary didactic purposes, deliberately tell the story in the middle of their Tuesday night narrative. They don't tell it as happened on Tuesday. They tell it in the middle of their Tuesday night narrative. Why would they do that? Well, I think we have a marvelous clue, and that is if we look at the third synoptic, which is Luke. And in Luke, here it is, in Luke chapter 22, where am I? Oh, I had this all set up, so let me take you to Luke 22. And notice what it is. Luke does the same thing. The feast of unleavened bread drew near. He doesn't say 2 days, but he says it was near. And then he says the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people. So it's exactly the same thing. They try to find a way, but they fear the people. Now, at precisely this point, after this statement right here, both Matthew and Mark insinuate the story of the feast and the rebukes. Notice what Luke does. then Satan entered Judas. What's going on here? I think the point is that Judas, let's say it this way, that Luke understands that what pushed Judas over the edge, what angered him so awfully that he decided to do something about it, was what happened on Saturday night. And when Jesus, he rebuked everybody. I think it was a quiet, sweet rebuke. But sin makes you stupid. And everybody else probably said, well, that's sweet. That's nice. You know what I'm talking about? When they got after Mary, what are you thinking about? And Jesus said, no, leave her alone. She's done this against the day of my burial. And everybody else in the room said, well, that's a sweet thing, I guess. I guess. But Judas, it settled in his heart. And I think what Luke is telling us, and what Matthew and Mark are telling, Luke is telling us explicitly, but Matthew and Mark are telling us narratively, is that rebuke. You know, Paul said later, and I wonder if Paul is not thinking of this passage. I'm going to check when I meet him. But Paul says later in Ephesians, let not the sun go down on your wrath, neither give place to the devil. And that angry heart of Judas had been unreasonably stung by Jesus' soft rebuke, but now he's had days to let it fester in his soul spirit. And so on Tuesday night, and Matthew and Mark tell the story of the feast here because they want us to understand a connection. Judas, angered by that rebuke. Now it's not mentioned in Matthew and Mark because they're close to it. People would have known the story. But at any rate, it's John who says specifically that Jesus rebuked Judas. But we know that happened, and I think it was the rebuke that settled and festered in Judas's unregenerate, angry, sin-enslaved heart, this distorted heart. And finally, he sees the opportunity. He's been pouting about this. And so Tuesday night, he says, I can get alone. I know the enemies. Now, I want to go back to, here we are at Luke. There's one other point I want to make, and then I'd like to tell you another story, if you can bear with me just a little longer. This was going to be a short day, but real quickly, there is a lot of confusion, and this is going to be so important in the next couple of days of our story. But there is a lot of confusion, almost universal confusion, about what it was that Judas was hired to do. So there is this idea that he was hired to identify Jesus. Like the Sanhedrin wanted to arrest Jesus, but they couldn't pick him out of a lineup. Now, you know that can't be true. Jesus rode into the city on Sunday, and the whole city welcomed him. He took control of the temple. The Pharisees and had been struggling with him for. There's no set of human facial features more familiar in the land of Israel than that of the Nazarene. So that's not the issue. I'll tell you where that idea comes from, that he was hired to identify, and that is the kiss. Judas says, the one that I kiss is the one. But you see, the kiss was for the Roman soldiers. The Jews were not allowed any force of arms. So they could arrest, but they had to use Roman soldiers. And because of the dynamics, and we're going to talk about it tomorrow, of this particular arrest, a whole cohort of soldiers comes, and they don't know who Jesus is. So the kiss was to alert the Roman soldiers as to who they were to arrest. But that was not why Judas was paid. That was what he was hired to do by the Sanhedrinists. And here, this is what it is. In verse 6, it could not be more explicit. It's such a helpful verse, because in verse 6, it says, he promised and sought opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of the multitude. That's his job. Jesus is a genius. He is wildly popular. Now that popularity is beginning to quietly dissipate ever since he drove that people to a decision earlier on Tuesday on the Temple Mount, when he made them choose between him and the Pharisees. But for what everybody can see, he is wildly popular. And that popularity has protected him. And the frustration of the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin is born of the fact that they haven't been able to capture him in the absence of the multitude. And Judas says, I can help you do that. Now listen, this sets us up for the rest of the week. The plan is not that Judas is going to follow Jesus around, and when he can look around and say, hey, there's nobody around, quick, get on the cell phone and say, get him now. That's not the point at all. They know the next time he is going to be in the absence of the multitude. And that's going to be at the Passover. This is 2 days before the Passover. That's emphasized again and again. And so the point is that at the Passover, you have the lamb slain, and then you go indoors. And there's not to be more than 20 or fewer than 10 feasting on each lamb. Now you could have a clan of more than 20 if you have more than one lamb, but they've come to Jerusalem for the Passover, Jesus and the 12. And so Judas is absolutely confident. I know it's a family time, but a very special time like this is what it is to follow a rabbi. You left your family behind. And so and Judas knows that on Thursday night, we'll talk about this tomorrow, they're going to gather. He doesn't know where, but they're going to gather. And so his job, his task is to alert the Sanhedrin as to where that Passover is going to be, where Jesus is going to keep the Passover, so that he can be arrested in connection. And let me say one other thing. I'm really late. I'm going to be done with this. There's another point that I'd like to take you to, but we better not do it today. But the point is that, please know this. On Tuesday night, we're back to our narrative. On Tuesday night, a plot is laid. And here, you've got to understand this. The whole point, the whole idea is to get the Nazarene arrested, tried, sentenced, and on his way to execution, hear me, while the city sleeps. That's the whole plan. As we go through the trials and everything about it, you've got to understand that Jesus' Jewish and Roman enemies have Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday ringing in their ears. And they have every reason to be perfectly convinced that if it gets out, if the city hears, this city that welcomed him as king and cheered him as he cleared the temple, if this city hears that Jesus is on trial for his life, there'll be a riot. So this whole plot is about getting Jesus, I'm going to say it again, arrested, tried, sentenced, and on his way to execution, so that by the time the sun comes up, it's a done deal and Rome has done it, and be as angry as you want. There's nothing you can do about it. That's the plot. Now, one more word. What does that have to do with Silent Wednesday? Well, my point is simply this, and this is where I'm taking you. It's important that we have that in place, but that is, understand what would happen on Tuesday night. But here's my argument with regard to Wednesday. And I'm going to throw out a hello to a guy named Rick Stark, who taught me this years ago. I was in a church in Pasadena, and a friend of mine in the church, just a really thoughtful guy, wrote me a paper. And I thought, man, that makes a lot of sense. And I've built on it ever since. And the point is this, that the plot was only laid late on Tuesday night. The logistics which are demanded by this plot are immense, because when Jesus is arrested in connection with the Passover, and we'll talk about it tomorrow night, on Thursday, as we'll talk about tomorrow, when Jesus is arrested, John is explicit that a whole cohort of soldiers comes to arrest him. Now, we'll talk about it, but the point is that, number one, the issue is that there's a sedition. That's what the Jewish leaders are saying. And so an order comes down to the soldiers and the commanders in the fortress Antonia, you got to put down a Jewish sedition. And they know something about what a Jewish sedition looks like. So they put together a whole cohort. And John says that they came with lanterns, weapons, and armor. This is a fully panoplied, because they're going out to put down a sedition, for heaven's sakes. Well, my point is, you don't just knock on the door and say, quick, I need 600 soldiers. There has to be an appeal. There has to be orders. It has to be passed down. People have to make preparation. There is huge preparation that has to go into a cohort of 600 or so soldiers being fully battle ready to go out and put down a sedition. But after he's arrested, he's going to be taken up, we're going to talk about this, to the Western Hill, and there's going to be a legal hearing before the entire Sanhedrin. Now, it's going to happen in the middle of the night. This is a culture where when the sun goes down, you go down, and the Sanhedrin is made up of, maybe not all 70 were there, but most of them were, and they were old men, most of them. They lived in various parts all around the city. And remember, you can't get a message here to there any faster than you can get a person from here to there. So somebody has to go out and get them all and say, okay, come, we think we've got him, come back. And that's going to take some time to assemble all these 70 men so that they can come to the priestly villa there in the Western Hill of Caiaphas. That is the priestly villa of Caiaphas, and be ready for a trial somewhere around midnight. So that takes a lot of logistics just to get, but after they find him worthy of death in the Jewish hearing, they're going to take him to Pilate. And Pilate, because they don't want to defile themselves, they induce Pilate and some drachma changed hands here, and to come out and set up his judicial apparatus on a gate on the outside of his palace. We're going to talk about this at length tomorrow. So the point is, think about what has to happen. And I'm going to say one more time. It only begins late on Tuesday night. Very late Tuesday night, the Sanhedrin are saying, we can't get it done. Judas comes along, says, I can help you. We can get it done. How should we do it? And they start, but they got to somehow secure a cohort of soldiers. They have to alert all of those Sanhedrinists from all over the place. They have to get to Pilate. They have to get an audience with Pilate. Now they can do that. These are the Jewish priestly authorities. But nonetheless, they're going to have to persuade him. And this is not going to be easy. Pilate's not happy about this whole thing. So all of this logistical preparation, if in point of fact, the triumphal entry was on Monday and the confrontation was on Wednesday, then this plot was laid on Wednesday night, and you've got to fudge with 2 days before the Passover. And now by tomorrow evening, you have to have everything in place. My point is simply this: I think it is reasonable. And again, coherence is important to me. I mean, it's important to put the story together so that it fits in all of its parts. And there's nothing about it which is incongruous or incoherent. Doesn't make sense or doesn't fit with the rest of it. And therefore, I think we're hugely advantaged to have what is remembered as a silent Wednesday, but in point of fact was very possibly a very busy Wednesday. And I'll say one other thing by way of conclusion. And by the way, I know it takes me a long time to quit. Can I tell you very quickly? My son said to me one time, Dad, I'd take him, he says, Dad, you don't quit. You say you're going to quit, you keep going. You say you don't, and I have an argument for that. I say, how many chapters are there in Philippians? Probably know there are 4. Well, here's an interesting point. What's the first word in the 3rd chapter? That's the word finally. So it takes me a long time to quit. Took Paul a long time to quit, but I'll leave that alone. I'm being silly there. Let me just conclude with this, that I think something else happens on that silent Wednesday. And that is, I think Jesus had the opportunity to make ready for the Passover, but I'll pick that up tomorrow. So we're overlong today, forgive me, but again, it's a silent day, but I haven't been very silent on the silent Wednesday. But I'm going to say once again, I think it's important to understand the dynamics of Jesus and his relationship with his family. I think the case can be made for Friday as the day of crucifixion, though I don't want to suggest that anybody believes anything else is wrong. Good men disagree, and you can reconstruct the week at any rate. Silent Wednesday, I think, is not a big deal. That doesn't bother me that there's Silent Wednesday, but I actually think that once you understand that the plot that was laid on Tuesday night had to be carried out, there were great preparations, and Wednesday is handy to that end. All right, thank you for being with me, and I trust this has been a help. And tomorrow on Thursday now, we will talk about Thursday then. So God bless you, and thank you once again for being with me.